Snow fell relentlessly, covering the empty streets in a thick, merciless blanket of white. The wind howled between the abandoned buildings, a cruel symphony of loneliness and despair. Ellis curled up against the cold brick wall, her thin coat offering little protection. Her fingers were stiff, her lips cracked. Every breath she took came out in a shaky cloud of mist. She didn't know if she would wake up tomorrow. Beside her, a worn-out German shepherd sat in silence, his amber eyes locked onto hers. There was something haunting in his gaze, an understanding, a silent acknowledgement of shared suffering. Hunger, exhaustion, isolation. He had been there for weeks now, appearing and disappearing, never getting too close, but never truly leaving either. They were the same, strangers in a world that had forgotten them. The cold was unbearable, burrowing into her skin like 1,000 needles. Alyssa needed warmth. She turned to the dog, his ribs faintly visible beneath his thick fur. His body shivered despite its strength. He wouldn't last the night. Slowly, she unwrapped her one and only blanket from around her shoulders and draped it over the animal. A reckless act of kindness, or maybe her final choice. For a moment, the dog remained still, his body tense, as if trying to understand her sacrifice. Then he moved closer, pressing his weight against her. His warmth seeped into her, barely enough to take the edge off the cold, but still a reason to keep breathing. Ellis exhaled shakily, her eyelids growing heavier. The hunger, the exhaustion, the cold, everything was pulling her under. Maybe it was easier to just sleep. Then the dog lifted his head. His ears twitched, his muscles tensed. A low, guttural growl rumbled from his throat. Ellis barely had time to react before he stood up, every hair on his body bristling. Her sluggish mind tried to grasp what was happening, but the fatigue was unbearable. Then she heard it. Footsteps, slow, hesitant. Someone was there, watching. The dog barked once, twice, his deep, sharp voice echoing down the empty street. Alyssa's breath hitched. Who was out there? A savior or something far worse? The barking shattered the silence, echoing off the brick walls of the alley. The German shepherd stood in front of Alyssa now, his body rigid, his growl deep and warning. He was protecting her, but from what? Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest. Run, the instinct whispered in her mind. But where would she go? Her legs were stiff from the cold, her body weak from hunger. Then she saw it, a shadow moving at the edge of the street. The figure hesitated under the dim glow of the streetlights, just far enough that Alyssa couldn't see their face. A heavy coat, gloved hands, slow, deliberate steps. Not a cop, not a drunk. Someone would stop for her. Hey! The voice was deep, rough, yet not immediately threatening. The person took another step forward. The dog barked again, louder this time, a warning. Stay back. Alyssa forced her frozen fingers to clench into fists. No one ever stopped for her. Most people walked by without so much as a glance. Some muttered insults, others crossed the street. The worst ones looked too long, their eyes hungry with something far worse than pity. She pressed herself against the brick wall. Was this one of them? Another monster in human skin? I'm not here to hurt you, the man said, raising his hand slowly. Jesus, kid, you'll freeze to death out here. She hated that word, kid. It made her feel small, powerless. Leave me alone, she rasped, though her voice barely carried over the wind. The man sighed, taking another step closer. The dog bared his teeth, his body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. Alyssa had never seen him like this before. The dog wasn't just warning. He was ready to fight. The man stopped, realizing that one wrong move could cost him a chunk of his leg. All right, he said, voice calmer now. I saw what you did, giving him your blanket. Alyssa stiffened. He had been watching. How long had he been standing there? The wind howled louder, pushing icy needles against her skin. The dog didn't move, still locked onto the stranger. Alyssa swallowed hard. She had a choice to make. Trust a stranger or face the night alone. The cold was a living thing, wrapping around Alyssa like a vice, sinking its claws into her skin. Every part of her ached, her fingers, her feet, even her chest with every shallow breath she took. Her body had stopped shivering minutes ago, and she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a very, very bad one. She had heard once that when the cold starts winning, it tricks you into thinking you're warm. She wasn't sure if she was there yet, but she was close. The stranger still stood in front of her, unmoving, hands raised in a silent plea. The dim streetlights barely illuminated his face, but she could make out the outline of his heavy coat. The dog remained between them, every muscle in his body tense, his growl deep and low, the kind that said one wrong move would end in blood. Ellis forced herself to focus, but it was hard. She was so tired. Hunger gnawed at her insides, twisting her stomach into painful knots. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten anything real. The half-eaten sandwich she found in the dumpster 2 nights ago. The stale bag of chips someone had thrown at her last week. How long could a person survive like this? I know you don't trust me. The man finally spoke again, his breath coming out in a misty cloud. I don't blame you. I wouldn't either. But I can't just walk away and pretend I didn't see you. People did it all the time. They walked past her like she was invisible. They turned their heads when she slept on park benches or curled up in alleyways. They pretended she wasn't there because it was easier that way. But not him. Why? Her voice barely worked when she spoke. I'm fine. Shalit. The biggest one she had ever told. The man exhaled heavily, glancing down at the dog. He reached into his coat pocket slowly, cautiously, like someone dealing with a wild animal ready to bolt. Alyssa tensed. Was this the moment everything went bad? Was this when he pulled out a weapon? But instead, he crouched down and placed something small on the frozen ground between them. A protein bar. The moment she saw it, something inside her snapped. Her stomach clenched violently, a raw, agonizing pain that made her feel nauseous. The hunger was unbearable, louder than her fear, louder than her instinct screaming at her not to trust him. It's yours, the man said, stepping back, his hand still raised. No strings attached. No strings attached. That phrase didn't exist in her world. Everything had a price. Kindness wasn't free. People didn't help others out of the goodness of their hearts. They always wanted something. And she had learned the hard way that sometimes what they wanted was worse than the cold. Her body betrayed her before her mind could make a decision. She took half a step forward. The dog shifted beside her, glancing between her and the food, his own hunger evident in the way his ears twitched. He was waiting to see what she would do. Her fingers twitched. If she moved too fast, would he grab her? Would this be a trap? The streets had taught her to always expect the worst, to never trust a hand that seemed too eager to help. But her stomach clenched again, and she swayed on her feet, lightheaded from the emptiness inside her. She had two options: take the risk or let the hunger win. And Alyssa wasn't sure which one scared her more. Alyssa's breath came in short, uneven bursts. Her frozen fingers twitched at her sides. The hunger in her gut twisted like a knife. The protein bar sat there untouched. The wind blew flakes of snow over its wrapper. It was so close. All she had to do was reach for it, but her body refused to move. The German shepherd stood firm, his body tense beside her, watching the man with unblinking focus. His ears twitched slightly, his tail held low but stiff, not trusting, not aggressive, but ready. The kind of readiness that said if the man so much as breathed the wrong way, he would strike. Alyssa wasn't sure why that made her feel safer. The man, still standing a few feet away, sighed through his nose, his breath a mist in the freezing air. Look, he said, shifting slightly. The dog growled, and he instantly froze in place again. Smart move. You don't have to take it, but if you don't eat something soon, you're going to collapse. And if you collapse out here, no one's going to find you until it's too late. Alyssa swallowed hard. She knew. She had seen what happened to the others, the ones who didn't make it through the night. Sometimes the city workers found them in the morning, frozen on park benches or tucked into alley corners. Other times, no one noticed until the smell gave them away. Her stomach clenched again, violently. This time, her body had already made its choice. She moved, not fast, just a slow, careful step forward. The dog didn't stop her. He only flicked his gaze toward her, as if assessing her decision. He wouldn't eat until she did. That realization sent a lump into her throat. He trusted her judgment, even when she wasn't sure she trusted herself. She crouched down, her fingers shaking as she grabbed the protein bar. The moment her hand closed around it, she hesitated. Was this a trick? Was there something in the food? She forced herself to look up, searching the man's face for any hint of deception. Was he smiling, waiting for her to take the first bite, so he could laugh at how easy she was to manipulate? But his expression didn't change. He just watched her with something that almost looked like concern. She ripped the wrapper open and took a bite. The taste was bland, dry, but she didn't care. Her body didn't care. The moment the food hit her tongue, she nearly choked in her eagerness to swallow. She hadn't realized how lightheaded she was until now. Her body had been shutting down. The dog's tail flicked once. His eyes locked onto hers. She broke off a piece and held out to him. She owed him this. He sniffed it, hesitated for half a second, then took it from her hand, chewing carefully. The man exhaled, rubbing his gloved hands together. "Good," he muttered. "That's good." Ellis stiffened. It was too easy, too simple. People didn't just give things away without expecting something in return. Her fingers clenched around the half-eaten bar. "What do you want?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but the cold edge in it was unmistakable. The man didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked tired. He shoved his hands into his pockets and looked at her for a long moment before finally saying, "I have a place. It's warm. No strings attached." She had heard that before, and it had almost cost her everything. The words hung in the air, heavy, dangerous. No strings attached. Ellis felt her fingers tighten around a half-eaten protein bar. The dog beside her stiffened again, his tail lowering slightly, but his eyes never leaving the man. He sensed it too, the risk, the unspoken threat hidden beneath those simple words. No strings attached. That phrase had nearly destroyed her once before. She had heard it from the kind-faced woman who promised a warm meal but locked the door behind her. She had heard it from the well-dressed man who said she could rest for a while in his apartment until he decided she owed him something. There were always strings. Always. Her body ached for warmth. Her stomach screamed for more food. But her instincts screamed louder. Ellis forced herself to meet the man's gaze, searching for the lie, for the catch. But all she saw was exhaustion, the deep, sunken kind, not like hers, not from hunger or cold. His was different, a tiredness of the soul. Still, that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. "Why?" Her voice came out cracked, barely audible, but it cut through the wind like a knife. The man exhaled slowly, shifting on his feet. For the first time, he hesitated. "I used to work at a shelter," he finally said, his voice lower now, rougher. "I've seen what happens to kids who stay out here too long." He glanced at her hands, her trembling fingers, her cracked skin. "You won't last another night in this cold." Alyssa's throat tightened. She hated that he was right, but she also hated that he thought she was just another lost kid, just another charity case. He didn't know her. He didn't know what she had survived. She looked past him toward the empty street beyond. She could run. She had done it before. But her legs felt weak, her limbs sluggish. She wasn't sure she had the strength to make it far. The dog let out a quiet whine beside her, almost as if he could feel the war raging inside her. The man sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Look, you don't have to come with me. I'm not going to force you. But if you change your mind, I'll be at the old bookstore 2 blocks down." He took a step back, then another. He was leaving. Alyssa didn't stop him. She just watched as his figure disappeared into the falling snow. His footsteps vanished almost instantly. For the first time that night, she felt something worse than hunger. She felt completely, utterly alone. The snow kept falling, relentless and indifferent. It piled up in uneven layers on the cracked pavement, muffling every sound, erasing every trace of movement. The man was gone. His footprints had already disappeared. If not for the protein bar still clutched in her fingers, Ellis might have thought she imagined the whole encounter. She sat there motionless, her back pressed against a frozen brick wall. The German shepherd remained by her side, his body warm against hers, his ears twitching at every distant sound, waiting, watching. the only thing in this world that had never abandoned her. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the protein bar to her lips. One bite, dry, chalky, but it didn't matter. Her stomach clenched painfully as she forced herself to chew. She had gone too long without food. Her body didn't trust it anymore. The nausea hit fast, but she swallowed it down. She had to eat. She had to stay awake, but the cold had other plans. It was creeping deeper now, past her skin, past her bones, settling into something more dangerous. Her shivering had stopped. That wasn't good. She had heard before when the body starts to give up, it tricks you. You stop feeling cold. You start feeling warm. Your mind slows down, tells you to rest just for a little while. The dog whined softly, nudging her leg with his nose. Alyssa blinked sluggishly. When had she closed her eyes? Panic jolted through her, sharp and immediate. No, 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 no. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. A deep exhaustion pulled at her, tempting her to let go, to stop fighting. But she had seen what happened to people who did that. She had seen their bodies stiff and lifeless, discovered too late. She gritted her teeth. Not me. Her breath came fast now, uneven. She had to focus. She had to move. But where? Where could she even go? Then she remembered the old bookstore. The man's voice echoed in her mind. If you change your mind, I'll be there. A risk, a gamble. But was it any worse than staying here? The dog was already watching her, waiting for her to decide. He would follow her no matter what. The thought sent a strange, aching pain through her chest. She wasn't alone, not really. Alyssa sucked in a sharp breath and forced herself to her feet. The world tilted violently. Her vision blurred. Her body screamed at her to stop, but stopping meant dying. She braced herself against the wall, swallowing the bile in her throat. Then, step by step, she started walking toward the bookstore, toward the unknown. She didn't know if she was walking toward salvation or straight into a trap, but at this point, what choice did she have? Alyssa's legs felt like lead as she trudged forward, her steps uneven, unsteady. The cold was inside her now, curling around her ribs, making each movement slow and clumsy. The German shepherd padded beside her, his breath visible in the freezing air. He kept glancing up at her, his amber eyes filled with something close to worry. She wasn't sure how long she had been walking. The streets were mostly empty, lined with darkened storefronts, their windows coated in a thin layer of frost. Her mind was sluggish, her thoughts coming in fragments. The bookstore 2 blocks? Was it 2 or 3? Had she passed it already? The dog suddenly stopped. His ears perked. His body tensed. Something was wrong. Alyssa forced herself to focus, blinking hard. The snow-covered sidewalk stretched ahead of her untouched, but behind them, footprints. Not hers, not the dog's. Someone was following them. Her pulse slammed against her ribs. She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance over her shoulder. The figure, far back, barely visible to the falling snow, moving slowly, steady, deliberate. Panic surged through her. Who was it? The man from before? Someone worse? Her breathing quickened. She wanted to run, but her body was weak. Her legs ached. If they caught her now, she wouldn't have the strength to fight. The dog let out a low growl, his stance shifting. He was ready to defend her. Alyssa had seconds to decide. Keep walking, start running, or turn and face whoever it was. Then the figure took another step closer. Alyssa's breath came fast, shallow, misting in the freezing air. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. The footprints behind them hadn't been there before. That meant whoever it was had been following her for a while, long enough to stay hidden. But why now? Why reveal themselves? The German shepherd let out another growl, deeper this time. He stepped in front of her, his muscles coiled like a spring, ready to snap. He sensed danger. That meant it was real, not her imagination, not paranoia. Someone was there, watching, waiting. Alyssa forced herself to keep moving. One step, then another. Her body screamed at her to stop, to rest, but the fear burning in her chest was stronger than the cold. She stole another glance over her shoulder. The figure was closer now, no longer a shadow person. She couldn't make out details, just a heavy coat. Dark boots pressing into the snow, a hood pulled low over their face. No hesitation in their steps. No signs of them turning away. Whoever they weren't just passing by. They were coming for her. Her throat tightened. What did they want? Rob her? She had nothing. Hurt her? No one would hear her scream in these empty streets. Or worse, was it someone from her past? Someone who finally found her? The bookstore. It wasn't far now. She could see the faint glow of the streetlight above its entrance, the old wooden sign swaying in the wind. If she could just make it there, then the footsteps behind her quickened. Whoever it was, they were done waiting. Alyssa's breath came in short, sharp gasps, burning her throat with every inhale. The stranger was closing in. She didn't need to look back to know they were there. Their footsteps crunching in the snow, steady, unhurried, like they already knew how this would end, like they were playing with her. Her body was fighting against her now. Her legs were weak, her vision blurred at the edges. Every step felt like she was wading through knee-deep water, her limbs numb and unresponsive from the cold. The only thing keeping her upright was the sheer force of panic, the instinct to survive. The German shepherd moved beside her, his pace matching hers. His ears flicked back, listening, calculating. He knew they were being followed. He could sense the danger in a way she couldn't. And then suddenly he stopped, froze completely, his muscles locked, his breath steady but sharp. A low growl vibrated in his throat, deep, menacing. Alyssa swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep moving, even as terror clawed up her spine. The bookstore was close now. She could see the glow of the flickering street lamp above its entrance, casting long shadows on the snow. Just a few more steps, just a little further, and she could... A sound behind her, different from before, no longer just footsteps. Something quicker, a shift in movement, a decision made. Her stomach lurched. They were coming for her now. Her body reacted before her mind did. She ran. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't fast. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, her muscles screaming in protest. But she pushed forward anyway, her fingers already reaching for the bookstore door in the distance. If she could just get inside, if she could just... A hand closed around her arm. Tight, unforgiving. She barely had time to react before she was yanked backward with such force that her feet slipped on the ice beneath her. A choked gasp left her lips as she stumbled, her body twisting, her shoulders slamming into the pavement with sharp bursts of pain. The dog's growl turned into a feral snarl, a blur of movement, the sound of fabric tearing, a struggle. But Alyssa wasn't focused on that anymore because now, for the first time, she could see their face, and her blood ran cold. Pain shot through Alyssa's shoulder as she hit the frozen pavement, the shock of it knocking the air from her lungs. Her pulse roared in her ears, deafening, drowning out everything except the grip still locked around her arm. Cold fingers, strong, unrelenting. Whoever this was, they weren't letting go. The German shepherd lunged, a vicious snarl ripping through the air as he threw his weight forward. Teeth flashing in the dim light. Then a struggle, a grunt of surprise, a curse. The grip on Alyssa's arm loosened just enough. She didn't hesitate. She tore herself free, scrambling on hands and knees, ignoring the pain in her limbs. She lunged toward the bookstore door, her fingers slipping on the icy handle. Locked, a scream of frustration built in her throat. But then a shadow moved from inside, a shape, a person. The door wrenched open, and suddenly she was being pulled inside. The warmth of the shop hit her, like a wall. The man from earlier stood in front of her now, his expression sharp, scanning the scene outside. His eyes landed on her attacker, and for the first time, she saw it. Recognition. "You," the man breathed, his voice cold, edged with something dangerous. The stranger hesitated, paused. The German shepherd still stood between them, growling, his stance rigid, protective. The seconds stretched thick with tension. Then the figure turned, without a word. They backed into the darkness, swallowed by the snow. Alyssa stood there, shaking, her breath ragged. The man's voice was distant, speaking to her, but she could barely hear him over the pounding in her skull. All she could think was, who was that? Why did he know them? And would they come back? Because something in the stranger's eyes told her this wasn't over. Not yet.